Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming today. We're going to finish today doing a panel discussion. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we'll be able to give you questions to the panelists today. So, yeah, thank you. Oh, wow, okay. I was going to say that first I was going to start with one of my questions, if that's okay. But please feel free to jump in and raise your hand. So we have seen today how different topics from chemicals, microplastics, and the last one about fungus and everything, how they're changing the environment. And it's being great, but also really concerning. And I just wanted to see, what is the first thoughts that comes to your head when you hear our health depends in our environment? And yeah.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Oh, sorry. What are your first thoughts when you hear that our health depends on our environment after these concerning talks?
So I think the case of Aspergillus resistance shows that we're conducting a gigantic evolutionary experiment. And I don't know, I suppose many of us are watching the David Attenborough series, aren't you? And the last episode on pastures focused on the wood wide web and all those kind of wonderful fungus-plant interactions that are so necessary for ecosystem services to work. What happens when this array of broad spectrum modern chemicals put on our environments? What actually happens to how they work? Obviously these antifungals and fungicides are going to affect all fungi to some degree, and that just has an impact that we know. We can see it in Aspergillus because it's one we care about because it causes a disease. But I want to know what's going on with all those other millions of fungal species out there, and indeed the bacteria and everything. So there's a large interaction going on, but we don't actually have eyes on it, and that's where we're moving in terms of our need to be able to view these emerging problems.
Well, I sort of came into microplastics by accident almost. I have a long-term interest in river systems and how humans interact with rivers. And the microplastics has taken me and our research group onto a journey to thinking about the state of rivers in the UK at the present time, and our rivers are in crisis. So there's a whole set of political issues, funding issues related around that, but the health of our rivers is critical if we're going to tackle the biodiversity crisis. The health of our rivers is absolutely critical. But also, it came into sharp focus with me during COVID as well, because if you live in Greater Manchester or in many areas of London, often your only green space, your only therapeutic space is your local river corridor. So it's never been more important from a variety of health aspects to take good care of our rivers. So I think about this in the round, not just about microplastics. I don't work on the toxicology of aspects of microplastics. There's a lot of work going on there, and there's some really interesting work. But I'm fundamental as a geographer. I'm interested in understanding where are the microplastics coming from, how are they getting into the rivers, where are they being stored, where are they likely to have the most ecological impact, and what can we do about it? But they're a critical indicator, we've found, of not just a microplastic problem, but they're a critical indicator of the fact that wastewater treatment isn't happening as it should be. And all the chemicals that Kerry talked about, many of those are related to wastewater treatment. They're coming through the wastewater system. So the microplastics are a kind of smoking gun showing that wastewater treatment isn't happening as it should. So that is a big concern of mine.
Yeah, and to that I'd really like to add the other part of the story is that when we talk about chemical pollution and waste, we're talking about just one of 3 planetary crises that we're facing. Mm-hmm. So we've also got climate change, biodiversity loss, and chemical pollution and waste is often the one that gets forgotten about when we're talking about all of the issues that we're facing. And it's really important that that's up there just as much as the others, especially when you think about all the interrelations that you got coming through into the work that Matt was talking about. All of those substances that we're talking about, all the azoles, those are the things that we're looking at in terms of the substances that are emerging that we're worried about in terms of not only their antifungal impacts, but also the impacts that they're having on the environment when they reach that space.
Do you want to add something, or?
Well, I would just say it's very easy to feel daunted by it, but equally I was quite inspired, and it was actually quite nice to see, firstly, that robust evidence bases are being built or have been established. Secondly, that there are sort of parliamentary level effects, rippling through. And I think As long as that momentum keeps going, we keep, research like this is sustained. For me, it's actually encouraging that this is happening. And rather than feel daunted, I think I want to feel motivated. But it is obviously quite a scary situation that we're in.
I think there's loads of hands, so I'm going to start asking. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. 1, 2, is that all right? My name is Pete, PhD student here. I wonder, like, a lot of the early parts of your talks are about joining departments up, talking to each other, helps the science become better and helps the solutions to become better. And I wonder, in this case, a lot of the solutions can come down to be resolved, as you were saying, in those 3 areas. With climate change, with the ecological crisis and environmental chemical pollution. All of them can be reduced, I think, by reducing fossil fuels consumption, eating more plant-based diets. And I didn't really hear about those coming through in your talks, and I wonder if you might be able to delve a little deeper in that. For example, like in terms of the land use, 85% of the land, agricultural land, is used by livestock. So if we want to rewild and prevent so much chemical pollution going into rivers, eating plant-based diets sounds like a pretty good move. I wonder if you could talk about those like next level solutions, more systemic solutions.
We only had 20 minutes.
Good luck.
Well, if you take plastics, we hear all the time. I think there's a new paper 2 weeks ago. Was it 172 trillion plastic particles in the oceans? Publication last week, survey done around the British coast. In the last 6 years, the concentration of plastics, microplastics in ocean waters has increased 100-fold in some locations around the UK. A lot of those microplastics come from wastewater. So in terms of longer-term solutions, we need to use much less plastic, and we need to have better ways of disposing of that plastic. I'm a pragmatist. I'm also an optimist as well. We all need to use less plastic and create less plastic waste, but that isn't going to happen anytime soon. And my message is, I keep banging on about the water companies, is that the best strategy at the moment to keep plastics out of rivers is to treat wastewater and to make sure that water companies do what we pay our bills for. This is all getting very political, but it's super political, and it's really strongly focused in the Thames region as well. The Thames region, Thames Water is the first water company to go live with some of you may have seen that. They now have a near real-time map which shows from 463 outfalls where sewage has been discharged into the rivers of the Thames region. And all the other water companies have to do that by the end of 2025, and many of them are going to do it by the end of 2023. So if you want to go wild swimming in the Thames, if you want to take your dog paddling, or if you're going kayaking, you want to know if there's shit in the river at that time. So this is happening. This is coming. The politics are really interesting. I'm going away from your question, but information and monitoring is a big part of the solution, and the public having information about what's going on. So in terms of discharging sewage, for example, the water company is going to be obliged to do this. The politics are, the water company executives, a lot of them are looking at Thames region now thinking, crikey, we're going to have to do this. The cat's out the bag now. We're going to have to show what we're doing. And the government's also looking at this thinking, well, do we want this on our watch before the next election? So watch that space really carefully, because that's going to evolve over the next 12 months and 18 months of the next election, because there's going to be lots of votes in sewage. I'm not answering your question there. I'm kind of ranting a little bit about sewage. But in terms of the bigger picture, in terms of plastics and in terms of the health of our environment and our rivers, which is a main concern of mine, that's a major strategy, a major thing that we have to do. And Kerry might want to say something about the role of the Environment Agency in that as well.
Yeah, so I'll come back to your question. So you asked about the climate change side. The Environment Agency has positioned itself as saying that the climate change issue is one of the most important things that we need to be tackling. It needs to be at the top of our list. I think there's a real message coming through as well, though, on the chemical side as to what we're expecting to see change associated with climate change. So coming back to Matt's talk, we think that we're going to see increasing amounts of fungicidal use associated both with agricultural use in plants, but also wider implications associated with climate change, that all of those things are interconnected. If we move to diets that are more plant-based, that means more chemicals associated with those plant crops to make them more efficient and resilient to those things. There's a lot of interconnected issues to think about when we are looking at all of these other options, but the main way to deal with them is by joining everything up together and working across government and across different policy areas to ensure those things are tackled.
I kind of hate myself for saying it, but I've become a grudging fan of Michael Gove over the years. And because he has actually done some really important things. And one was launching the 25-year plan for the environment, and also making sure that the Environmental Land Management Scheme, ELMS, hasn't foundered. And it's really, so now this is the silver lining to the Brexit cloud, is you can get real subsidy for going soft on the environment, taking pastures back into wood pasture, these higher tier categories which are now opening up. And so that means you can actually be able to scientifically farm both biodiversity and food. Maybe you sacrifice the parts of the country where they're really good for growing sugar beet, and you're hammering them with agricultural chemicals, but at least they're compartmentalized, whereas those more neppy type places where you shouldn't be farming hard can be set aside for wildlife. So that's where we're starting to get intelligent about this, rather than just basic subsidy across the whole system.
I think there was a question. Yeah. One. I think they're going to give you the mic as well.
This question's for you, Professor Matthew Fisher. Concerning fungi and mould in flats and houses. In the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that there was a 2% of housing untreated, which basically there is really quite a large proportion of people living in these mould-infested flats. What is the long-term plan of the government to eradicate this problem?
So, as a scientist, it's not my...
Obviously.
I can't comment on it, but what we do as scientists is we develop eyes on problems so that we actually see that there is a problem there. And it's really, really complicated. But this is why I quite carefully made my point that mold exposures are healthy and necessary. And we need to think about children here, because the first 100 days of a child's life are very important in terms of their immune system engaging with the environment and developing a healthy repertoire of behaviors. Now, the thing is about Awab, he was reared in a house where he had an extraordinary exposure to a bioaerosol that didn't allow his immune system to develop correctly. And what I'm worried about is obviously, there's a lot of houses with this problem. We have a lot of children in those houses growing up with hypersensitivity disorders, asthma. After smoking, mold is a leading trigger for asthma. It's really, really complicated, and it's really socioeconomic. But this is, I suppose, just viewed best through the lens of this being a disease of poverty, and that smart financial deployment and regulation is needed. Now that we're starting to understand the scale and depth of the problem, and at that point, it's up to the housing agencies and so on and so forth to...
So would you agree that black mould is more highly dangerous to a child or even to an adult, where it creates the breathing issues and stuff like that within the home when it's breathed in long term?
Yes, this problem starts with the child. I mean, I think that an adult which has grown up with a healthy exposure to fungi coming into a mouldy home will be much more resilient than a child that was brought up in that home and developed an aberrant immunity in the first 100 days of life. But I'm straying well outside of my comfort zone here, because I'm not an immunologist, and this is really deep, dark immunology here.
Because when you mentioned it about that young boy, it sort of affected me, because I've worked alongside crisis in the past, under homelessness and stuff. And I've also had my children living in damp-infested places. One of my daughters was living in a serious bad place in Barking, and she had all black mould on her walls and everything, and it was a health hazard. But you tell the landlords to deal with it, and they don't want to touch it. But so for me, it's will the government and the housing and the councils together eradicate this problem? Because it obviously is in extreme circumstances, a problem that needs to be dealt with.
Yes, and we built a lot of homes 20, 40 years ago, and they're now past their, they're aging, and there's a critical need to redevelop British housing. And, that is the job of government, is to find the resources and to focus on that.
Thank you. Sorry.
Liam?
I've got lots of questions, but I'm sure I'll speak to you afterwards. But I've got two main ones, and probably in terms of chemicals in rivers, and to draw on the elephant in the room, UK REACH is the next step for us here as an island nation, which arguably also has its own challenges in comparison to the rest of Europe. We rely quite a bit on our watch lists from the European Water Framework Directive to guide where we should go and generate evidence into emerging substances. Do we have any steer as to how that's going to be managed here in the future, or will it still align with the Water Framework Directive? That's my first question.
So we don't have a definitive answer, actually, as to whether or not we plan on adopting watch lists as they are considered coming through in Europe. But what we have done is take all of the substances that Europe has proposed and put them through our prioritisation early warning system so that we understand an England perspective as to whether or not we're concerned about those substances, which forms the first part of our decision making in that regard.
The reason I ask is you showed the example of fipronil, and that obviously has just appeared on the watch list, and whether there's a targeted programme here to follow up on fiprols as well as other pet parasiticides.
Yeah, so fipronil along with imidacloprid are very much at the top of our list in terms of priorities for veterinary medicines. So they're substances that have had the plant protection product usage stopped, but they still have ongoing uses as biocides or as veterinary medicines. So that's where a lot of our focus is now in terms of liaising with the Veterinary Medicines Directorate to see what we can do in terms of understanding ways of minimising those entering the environment.
Brilliant, thanks. I have a second short question, perhaps to tie the three strands together. Microplastics at the end of combined sewer overflow outfalls. You mentioned that they're washed away and then replenished perhaps with the combined sewer overflow vents. But it's not just the microplastics, it's what's on them as well, right? So I just wondered whether there's any substantial knowledge that we have on what's on them from a microbiological point of view, but also a chemical, and whether the dynamics of what you're talking about means you can link the microplastics in the riverbed downstream to what's coming out in untreated sewage, which will be very different from a chemicals perspective.
Yeah, indeed. I've often commented that these microplastics are marinated in sewage. So they're often biofouled, and there's quite a bit of research going on about this sort of the coatings on microplastics. A lot of that research is at early stages. But yeah, it's not just the microplastics themselves. They're often vectors for a whole range of other things. So a lot of research to be done on that. When we see these, the point I was making, when microplastics accumulate at high concentrations on the riverbeds, the only way they can do that is if they're being discharged into the river and when the river's at low flow. Otherwise, we wouldn't see them. So the very presence of those microplastics is an indication that what we call dry weather spilling, which shouldn't be happening. If the sewer overflows are working well at high flows during flood events, the microplastics don't settle on the riverbeds. They get washed away and we don't see them. They ultimately end up somewhere else. But so our focus has been very much on the riverbeds, because that's where, if the microplastics are accumulating there, they're likely to do the most ecological damage, whether it's the plastics themselves or the things that are coated around them.
Thanks.
So, a comment and then a question, probably for you, Kerry. So the comment is, it's very obvious from all the presentations today that monitoring and accurate monitoring is really essential to everything that we worry about in the environment, and it's great to see that the Environment Agency's expanding its activities in the microplastic monitoring in our rivers. So I'm just wondering, Kerry, you're gonna find them. We've heard about that. The question then is, what will happen? What can you do about it? And I guess the middle part is all to do with more research and the toxicology side of it and the health impacts. But I'm wondering, from an Environment Agency point of view, your activity is going to have to stop, at that, I guess, the monitoring side and the provision of the data. What then will happen? Who do you talk to next? And is there a mechanism within the agency to ensure that those next important steps are taken forward at the right time and at the right speed to ensure that we solve the problem. And for example, if we believe, you know, a lot of the literature that suggests that tire wear is a big source of microplastics in our rivers, then clearly we can understand what the policy change may need to be. So, you know, how do you have that joined up conversation in government?
So part of this is around the join up that we have in terms of our microplastics work and our chemicals work. So part of the solution is to ensure that we're not thinking of those two things separately when we're doing our work in this space. The other part of the solution is that we need to join up with other people who are responsible for that pollution. So the Environment Agency is working, for example, with different people that are undertaking research in this space. So, for example, National Highways are due to report soon in terms of their latest work. Some of the work that we need to understand is what can we actually do to reduce the load of microplastics. The water industry has just done their Chemicals Investigation Programme 3, which showed that 99% of microplastics were removed from the effluent. But the result of that is that they move to sludge. They're not destroyed, they are moving. So it's how we actually manage and reduce the exposure to the environment, not just going straight into the rivers, but also anywhere that it might be moving and entering into the environment. So it's how we can actually look at policy and regulatory options that will lead to reductions in those things.
But clearly, you know, as the problem is with all plastics, it's the overuse that we have of them in society, and clearly there's going to have to be a lot more discussions above that to ensure that we reach a solution.
There's a lot that needs to be considered in relation to how we minimise our use of plastics in society, but also how we are actually able to reduce what is used from entering the environment at end of life, because we should be moving towards a circular economy that doesn't allow that to be the case.
I think this comes back to Pete's question about fossil fuel use. I mean, clearly, you know, as we remove that from our transport sector, then there's going to be increased use in other sectors, such as plastic reduction. So it is a big worry, I think, going forward.
It's worth also bearing in mind there's a lot of international work going on with the United Nations Plastics Treaty and various other work that we're also linking into.
There's a question at the back.
My question is maybe something related to, I guess you just mentioned, because we've heard that if the wastewater plant functions properly, it takes out the microplastics from the wastewater, but then it goes to the sludge, and lots of that goes back into the environment as a fertilizer. So I was just wondering, is there any information that you're collecting or you know about the evidence around the microplastics in the soil and pathway to the river through the erosion and surface runoff?
Yeah, so I mentioned in my presentation that we're currently looking at the Chemicals Investigation Programme 4, and that's an issue that we're looking at developing with the water companies to explore exactly how many microplastics and the chemicals associated with those actually do move through from the sludge to soil and to groundwater, but also trying to understand what can be done to actually minimise that microplastic load in sludge. Yes, so the work that gets undertaken as part of the Chemicals Investigation Programme was all made publicly available for the last phase, so I presume that the same will be true going forwards. So they've just released all of the data, but also the reports for 3.
I think if you want to add, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really important question. I've thought about this quite a lot. You know, it's all very well for me to go banging on about, you know, the water companies need to treat the wastewater, but once the sludge is full of plastics, what do you do with the sludge? And the sludge is distributed on agricultural land. I would argue that until we reduce the amount of plastics that we use, and that's not going to happen anytime soon, treating the wastewater and having plastics in sludge and spreading that on agricultural land, which is probably the best use of that at the moment, is a far better solution than discharging microplastic-rich, sewage-rich wastewater into ecologically sensitive riverbeds during low flows. And the evidence so far is that there's a lot of research on microplastics in sludge and soils, but that doesn't seem to be a major source of microplastics coming into rivers in comparison to the microplastics that are coming out of overflows and wastewater treatment. And if microplastics are going to be washed off agricultural land, that's going to happen during flood events, during storm events. They're not likely to settle out. Ultimately, they end up in the ocean. That's not ideal. But my main concern is keeping microplastics out of ecologically sensitive riverbeds in high concentrations. There's no perfect solution to this, but that's the best solution we have at the moment.
If you want to bring the mic. Thank you.
I wanted to have another punt at something that's a bit like Pete's question, really. I mean, clearly it seems unsustainable that you're going to continue or to be able to keep up with chasing all the chemicals that are being used by industry in whole loads of products. You're just playing catch up all the time. It's hard to argue against the use of fungicides, let's say in agriculture, for instance, when it's getting us better quality and cheaper food. And similarly, it's hard to argue against the use of plastics because they're just very, very handy things. So going back to your thing in the first place, Steph, about looking at this in a much more holistic way as a whole system, what are the solutions to this going to look like? Now, we as environmentalists are always accused of, telling people not to do something and banning things. So should we be reaching out strongly for the precautionary principles or perhaps, new uses for plastics until we have methods to ensure that they don't escape more widely into the environment and cause harm? Now, innovators come back and wave the flag of the innovation principle. So how much should this community be out there trying to really flag up the precautionary principle? Because at the moment, the innovation principle wins. It's just free for all in terms of innovating, in terms of the products and their uses.
Who wants them? Yeah.
So innovation is really important, and so if you think of genetic modification, I mean, that's really going to get us out of a bind here, because a lot of these fungicides are for crops that are predated on by pathogens where you can just, if you can rationally genetically modify them with the resistance effectors, then they're bomb-proof, and you can then downscale your fungicide use in the environment. So that's, we just, that block is now unblocking, and I think we're going to start seeing GM opening up again and kind of proper, smart, clever, get out of jail free GM. But I also think, going back to the actual chemicals themselves, when you put, you pin your hopes on a new clinical antifungal, and we have not got a lot out there, you need to ring fence that mode of action. We don't need new antifungals. We've got plenty, so we've got the azoles, just keep on using the azoles. They'll do a crop protection in agriculture, allow alorifim to be used in patients, but make sure that you don't get DHODH going into agricultural use. Put that effort into GMOs, and then you can have your cake and eat it.
So the other thing that I'd like to add is that we do need to have a degree of chemical innovation. Our society has significantly benefited from the innovation that's happened to date, and will need to continue to benefit, particularly in the pharmaceutical sector. The other thing I would say, though, is that we need to be really conscious of the particular properties that we're developing in chemicals. So when we look at chemicals that are being designed for things like extreme persistence, for the longevity properties, we need to be really cautious as to whether or not it's really necessary to have that degree of longevity in the products that we're using, and to link through just the appropriate amount of longevity and persistence properties for chemicals in the products that they're actually being used for, so that we're sensible as to when we're being precautionary, so that we don't end up with long-term issues as a result of new chemical design.
Question? No.
It's a question for Matt, actually. Do you think that having resistance to these fungicides is entirely a bad thing? Because we have a whole branch of our immune system that is meant to fight off fungal infections, and especially for things like asthma and allergies, like you say, early life exposure to them and at a low level, a diverse level, is actually quite good in terms of prognosis for developing those sorts of diseases. So do you think that if more fungi were resistant to these sorts of chemicals that have been put into the environment, then the rate of those sorts of diseases might decrease through just general exposure?
Yeah, so I'm not so worried about the general public. I mean, we've got two things there. We've got the mouldy homes, and that can be dealt with by government being smart. But we also have those fungal infections, invasive fungal infections, which if they're resistant, then we lose the patient that should have survived. And that's where we absolutely need antifungal drugs to work and not to have their mode of action, nibbled away at, as we're seeing with Aspergillus fumigatus. So, yeah, we do.
It's just the really invasive ones and the vulnerable sort of patients that would need those. Yeah.
Okay, we have one more question there, and then I'll come back to you.
I was thinking about solutions, and every time you mentioned a solution, it occurred to me it was a red flag for a particular section of the community. If you do X to solve problem Y, somebody over here has a problem with your solution. So GM makes sense, but you're going to have to win an argument with the general public in the United Kingdom, yes? And we've got lots of different domains here, which are sort of interrelated, but in the public, they're going to get swamped by this information when you try to understand it. And I was trying to peer it back, and I don't think Pete's wrong. How do you simplify all of these messages? It's about moving to a sustainable society and not being consumers. And then you hit the economic buffers. So I was just really intrigued to hear about how you would create a unified public message which you know isn't immediately going to die when you hold it into the economic political fire.
That's definitely one of you, Kerry. The one argument to bind in the dark, let's bind them. Sustainability, you said it. Yeah, I mean, our pockets are going to get hit no matter whether we like it or not. I mean, what's coming at us is going to be quite a thing. I think we need to be able to feed ourselves and to be nice to one another, have equitable housing, and we've got a renting crisis, a social housing crisis at the moment. That needs to be solved. Everyone needs clean water, roof over their head, and we don't need so many billionaires out there. Tax them at 100%.
Yeah, I mean, I take a huge amount of energy and encouragement from the citizen scientists out there, and sustainability is the key message. Let's leave the environment in a better state than we found it. But the sort of River Valley initiatives that I see around Greater Manchester, people who care about their river environments, people who care passionately about them, there are messages you can get across that strike a chord there. The Times, New Scientist, iPaper, lots of newspapers have launched campaigns about Save Our Rivers. This is a very narrow part of the agenda. But I have always said that the way that we treat our rivers is an indication of the nature of our civilization, and the state of our rivers at the moment is pretty grim. So we've failed horrendously particularly over the last 13 years since 2010 to look after them. But they're the lifeblood of the nation, the heartbeat of the nation, and we need to look after them. That's a very simple message.
And just to build on that sustainability message, I think the other part of it is around innovation in relation to things that allow us to be more sustainable, things that allow us to have less consumption. So having investment in new chemicals, but those that allow you to lose less in terms of the amount that you need in product, the size of products, all of those things that rely on additional amounts of materials.
I think I might just add, I feel like as a kind of species, we're very much in the here and now, and we kind of don't really think much beyond our lifetime. And I guess my message would be, what's the point of anything if there's not going to be a sustainable environment, to sustain us in the future? So...
Can I add a point to the end of that? Just sorry to butt in ahead of you. We all talk about doom and gloom, when it comes to chemicals, certainly in rivers, and I agree with you in terms of the chemical contamination issue. But it wasn't very long ago that the Rhine was one of the worst rivers in the world, and now it's one of the cleanest. So there's certainly interventions that have been put in place to make the Rhine a very, very chemically clean river. And that can be done here as well, I think. So there's definitely a recovery that can be done through sustainable living. That's the first thing. Second thing is I think our access to knowledge as a general public, echoing the citizen science thing, but the engagement is massively different now than it was certainly when I was growing up. And when we started even looking at combined sewer overflows about 10 years ago, everybody thought we were nuts. It was a crazy, small, minor pathway to the environment. So, you know, I think certainly the access to science and access of the general public to debates like this and forums like this has improved. So I think that's part of sustainable living, is ask those questions, keep asking them, and keep fighting for them.
I think that was time for the last question. So just wanted to say, do we have, I think we're on time. One last one, yeah? Yeah. Can you give the... Thank you.
Thank you. Speaking of the microplastic, and the microplastic obviously most from plastic pieces, large plastic pieces, and there's a study said like 4.9 billion tons of plastic not in the natural environment. I believe that most part are the plastic pieces, not microplastic. And do you think that if we should set the plastic pollution as more important than the microplastic, even the microplastic has more toxic compared with the normal plastic pieces? And given that also the most of the chemicals and toxic things is from the plastic flame retardant or something like also from the large plastic pieces. Given the mass concentration and the numbers altogether, what do you think of plastic pollution compared with the microplastic?
Do you want to? Yeah.
Both enormous problems. You know, macroplastics, big plastic items, microplastics. So one and the same in many ways. So we know we need to use less plastic, and we need to dispose of plastic more effectively. But I've seen hideous situations in rivers around the world with huge volumes of macroplastics floating on the river surface. The microplastics that we see in the river basins, most of those haven't broken down from larger plastic particles in the river system, because I don't think they're in the river system long enough. The residence time is so brief. Most of those microplastics have come out of the wastewater system. But we do have a lot of macroplastics as well. But the plastics are pretty resilient. A lot of those don't break down. They hang around. We've got plastics in floodplains that are 50, 60 years old. So the plastic problem isn't a new problem. It's an emerging contaminant because we've just become aware of it. Mm-hmm. But our rivers have been full of microplastics for 60 years. So that raises all sorts of interesting ecological questions that we haven't really started to think about.
Thank you. Do you want to add something quickly on that? Or?
Yeah, I guess that Jamie nailed it. Plastic is a legacy of microplastic, essentially, because that is the ultimate source of microplastic. So if we want to tackle microplastic, we need to really be tackling the plastic issue as well. Okay, I think we've run over slightly. We've just come to the end. So clearly we've heard from three, I think, in isolation, quite substantial issues. And then when we consider the interconnectivity, I think we can realise that they're even part of an even bigger problem that I don't think each of us will be able to tackle alone. So I just want to say a big thank you to everyone for your attention. Thank you very much to our speakers and to Helena for chairing the panel. It's been a really interesting afternoon, so hope everyone agrees. And I just need to, before you go outside, we've got some drinks and a reception outside, but before that I have to flag our next seminar, which will be how air pollution affects the brain. And you can scan the QR code there if you're interested. You can sign up and register. It's free via Eventbrite, and that's scheduled for April 24th. So with that, I hope you can thank all our guests and see you outside.